And again, this was not intentional. I didn't grow up knowing any of these names or knowing that I was going to ever make wine in my life. It just sort of happened to me. But kind of makes you wonder if there's something in the DNA that you just can't get past. Making wine. It seems like a good idea. So, and this is one of the things that's funny about me. I love learning about other people's jobs. Like for me, it's hard being a winemaker because that's all anybody wants to talk about when you go meet a group of people. With dentists and bankers and all these, like, I've never worked in a bank. I've never drilled on a tooth. That seems so fascinating to me. But there's something about food and wine that just people, it brings us all together. We were talking earlier, like any culture, wedding, whatever, you get enough people together, they're going to sit, they're going to eat, and they're going to drink something. Yeah. And they may fight a little bit, but generally they're going to enjoy themselves. And that's an important thing. It's easy to, make a little bit of wine at home, kind of romanticize the idea of, well, maybe I'll make a little more wine and turn it into a business. I'll go over some pros and cons of that. But I do believe that it is only a business if you can sell it. The IRS has their own belief between what's a hobby and what's a business. Mm-hmm. And there are certain things you have to reach and do. I didn't really think about those things. I too, like a lot of small producers, got caught up in how enjoyable it is to make wine, to pick grapes, to smell the smells and live the life, to feel like you're, creating something with your hands. So, and just, I'm sure Chris and Antonio talked about loading the press and cranking it down. That's what we do. I shovel it in, I shovel it out, take out the pressings on the tractor. That's the business. Very connected. It's very enjoyable. That's not the most important part of the business. That's the fun part of the business. Small producers, there are three basic ways you can do it. The way we did it, and it's just because having this resource of the land, growing your own grapes, you basically save the cost of having to purchase grapes. And then that gives you a leg up so you can pay yourself something while you make the wine, sell the wine, next vintage comes. Most small producers buy the grapes. And there's this system where, and it's great that this exists, small wineries can rent space inside of larger wineries, which allows us the economic advantage of not having to purchase, $100,000 worth of equipment that you only use during harvest time. Maybe you can use their bottling equipment. Maybe there's some tank space. It's a very capital intensive industry if you want to scale up and make a lot of wine. And a lot of the equipment isn't used frequently, especially that harvest stuff and that fancy $100,000 press that's so gentle on the grapes. It's like, great. The other 11 months of the year, you're not doing much with it. And it's a big capital expenditure. So piggybacking with some of these larger wineries and renting space allows us the ability to create something reasonably sized in there. Of course, if you have the money, you should create your own facility and not have landlords and vertically integrate as much as possible. That's very economically challenging. It's alcohol. So that means that there are taxes. So that means that there is regulation of all sorts. That means that there is legal liability. So there are lots of licenses you have to have in place. The big overarching one is the federal TTB thing. So when you apply, they want to know where the money's coming from. You have to fill out a form. Mine's embarrassing. Mine's like, my $11,000 is coming from a creditor. But it doesn't matter who you are. You have to fill out all the stuff, show proof of funds, blah, 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 so that you're not violating alcohol laws. They want to see maps of the facilities. They want to know how wastewater is handled. They want to know who has what percentage. Tons and tons of legal stuff. And then if you break that down, then it's like, okay, I'm in California. Am I an LLC? Am I an S Corp? Do I have partners? What are the percentages? I have to report all of that back to the feds. But eventually you get this big overarching master license, basically. And then you go down. Oh, and part of that is labeling. There are, if you look at any label, there are certain things you are required to have. One of them, of course, is going to be your sulfite declaration, your alcohol percentage, because that used to be a tax thing. Wines above 14% were taxed at a higher rate than below 14%. And then sparkling is taxed at another higher rate. And then I think above 18% is taxed again. So breaks down to different amounts. We've changed a little bit of that over the years. There's a big government warning about driving, about drinking while pregnant. You have to have that. And then there are regulations about font size. You can't vary that percentage of alcohol too much. There are minimum font sizes for your sulfite wine. So, and these are things that are kind of challenges in the industry, because a lot of this is stuff that was passed in the 60s and 70s. And now, like, the sulfite thing is much more complicated than we thought. If you're going to label, if you put a vintage on it, there's a minimum percentage that needs to be from that vintage to label it 2018. If you're going to label it with a varietal name, Barbera, if you label that by a county, it needs to be 75%. If you label it by something called an AVA, which is a smaller entity within a county, like the Russian River Valley is within Sonoma County, but it's a smaller, tighter designation, then that percentage goes up. And you need to have records tracking, in theory, every barrel. Every time you top up evaporation and barrel with something else, you need to be able to track where that thing came from that went to this, so that when you're audited, hopefully that never happens, you can show where every drop in every barrel came from.
How often are you audited?
I don't know any small producers that have been audited. I hear that the large guys, they have way more accounting to do than we do. And we're just basically not worth the money to go on bankrupt me or give me a parking ticket. But I hear that enforcement is going up, and you should always act as if, better just to keep your nose clean and sleep at night than to. I know people that haven't kept records for years. And that's just a terrible idea. Don't do that. So the federal thing, but then you come down to the state level, which is the ABC here in California. You have to show them a bunch of stuff. They're very worried about making sure that you are respecting wholesale rules, that there are certain businesses that you can't have in conjunction with your winery. So you can't be like an importer distributing and there are certain crossovers that are not allowed. There are also a lot of other. So I have a tasting room in Oakland that is a whole other ABC license. And then, premises inspection, then you have a whole other round of insurance for that. It's a lot of technical stuff lining up all these forms. And it's not necessarily that difficult, but I looked at the files on my laptop, and it's a good, okay, I filled out 42 pages worth of information to read these things. And it took 9 months to get everything approved. So the tasting room required a zoning variance. Oh, that was a pain. Zoning and a conditional use permit. So I worked with Oakland for 9 months and wrote a 45-page zoning request and went to the board meeting and presented at local neighborhood councils, because this is alcohol. Maybe they don't want alcohol, even though there are 5 bars right here. And I'm not I'm not going to destroy the community if I move in. I had to prove all those things. So, and that's not to say that there shouldn't be any oversight. So where is that balance between free enterprise and, responsible community behavior? We need some of these things. And then you get into other things like you have to be registered with the FDA. Wine's a food product. There was a mess up with my FDA number, another agency. I've been working on this for 6 months. Can't get it finished. Many, many hours. CDTFA, CDFA, California Department of Food and Agriculture. You're going to have forms from all of those. If you're going to weigh grapes, you need to have a weighmaster license. That's going to be another $150 and a bunch of forms to make sure that you know how to weigh something and read the number. Sales stuff, you know, resale certificate, pay your quarterly sales tax, da, 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 da. So there was a point where I was like, yeah, start. I know the model, start a winery. We'll sell it direct through a tasting room. That's the best margin. When you do wholesale, sell things to distributors, you make half as much money. In my case, slightly less than half. So when you're small, you get beaten up on the price. So, okay, we can do that. These are all forms. We'll just figure it out. Took long time to get everything lined up, and finally opened up a tasting room in 2019. I had started the process in 2018, early. So anyway, not to say that there are pros and cons. It's not necessarily easier if you were a larger winery. If you're a small winery, at least I didn't have any outside help. I just did everything myself, save the money. You can hire people to do all this for you, but it's going to take more time. So best to know the whole process, and I'm glad that I do now. So you finally get open, and this is assuming that during all of this, you still are making wine. You have wine in bottles, wine in barrel, because you're going to be sort of in a cycle of harvesting and then bottling and alternating those two things. Sometimes they happen at the same time. For me, at my scale, it's roughly, I think one year I hit 3,000 cases, which barrel-wise would be about 150 barrels. Right now, it's about 90 barrel production every year. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. 2021 was we were down 60% the harvest. So only like 38 barrels made that year. Sometimes you buy fruit. In addition to the stuff I grow, I've made Cabernet and some other more obscure Italian whites. It's always nice to have diversity when you have a tasting room. You want to always be able to offer somebody something interesting. Or I used to think that. Now I'm pulling way back on it. This point, my thinking has changed completely, and I want to have fewer SKUs and be focused on like 6 really good wines and stop doing the direct-to-consumer sales. So these models change over time. How are you going to make money? Yeah, that's the last thing people like me, when we're thinking about making wine, is, you know, if you build it, they will come.
Sure, there you go.
If it's good, it will sell itself. I can't think of any other industry as oversaturated as the wine industry in California. There are literally thousands and thousands of wineries. It's hard to differentiate things. You can buy the same wine on the bulk market and have 30 different brands putting their own label on the exact same wine in the bottle. That's legal. That's not uncommon. So a lot of it is kind of shrouded in mystery. So it makes it even harder for the consumer to really differentiate things, to figure out what type of wine they're getting. These days, we're interested in things like organic certification, biodynamic. Are you sustainable? Do you use sheep in the vineyard? There's a whole category called natural wine, which is sort of it's hard to locate, but it's like a more pure, simplistic take on wine, which can vary radically from like some of the best wines I've had to some of the worst wines I've had. But it's all natural wine. It just kind of is spontaneous and makes itself. There's been a lot of market move towards that. I'm 50. I'm a little bit crusty. I like the style that I like. The style that I make is the style I actually prefer to drink. These dry, textured, slight tannin wines that you drink with dinner. I'm not looking, for the most part. I make a little bit of rosé. I do make a Chardonnay, but they're this more old school style. These days, there's sweet wines, there are low alcohol wines. Sparkling has really happened to a huge extent. I get asked, if I was at the tasting room, I guarantee 2 people would come in and ask me if I'm making pet nap sparkling wines. It's like, well, petulant naturality.
Oh,
Yeah, it's when you bottle wine that's still fermenting and let it finish in the bottle so it carbonates itself.
oh.
Yeah, it can be quite good. It also can go off the rails incredibly easily. So, and that's why I haven't done it, because I'm not actually inside of a warehouse and facility, and I would want to make it, I'd want to, it's not the same as champagne method, but I would want it to be clear and not full of sediment and all that kind of stuff that, the kids love. And I'm like, okay, we've got some generational shift happening here between what's okay for me and what other people are looking for. But basically, you need to either go into the wholesale part, which has become more difficult because a lot of consolidation. Right now, we're looking at a downturn in wine consumption coupled with rising interest rates and a very peculiar moment in the economy that has everybody freaked out. So everybody, including me, I have a list of 47 distributors across the US I've been hammering on. And I'm getting about my 6th round of emails is about to go out. And one by one, I get a no or a give up on them. And I haven't been able to open up any new states. It's tough. It's really competitive right now because everybody is doing the same thing. Our tasting room sales are down. I need to move more wine by wholesale. So the guys that were getting 2 boxes of samples every day are now getting 8. So I just did a tasting with some people yesterday in Napa, and very kind words. I think this is the best wine we've had in 3 days of Napa wines. Your quantities are too small. You're too cheap to be expensive, and you're too expensive to be cheap. You're stuck in nowhere land. We can't do anything with. That is not the first or the 10th time I've been told that. And it's a challenge because, I set prices in the tasting room. I try to figure out, I don't want to be expensive. I didn't grow up drinking expensive wine. I want it to be accessible to people who are interested in the style. So when I opened up the tasting room, you could do a tasting of 8 wines for $10. I wanted it to be democratic and open and have as many people try the wine as possible. Now I'm going to charge you $35 to try 6 wines. And I'm probably going to have to ratchet it up further because just the way things are shifting, it's painful. I'm not where I want to be as a small business, but I'm also trying to survive as a small business. And the whole world is changing around me constantly, every 6 months. It's really attractive, the idea of opening a tasting room so you can sell direct and make full margin. Maybe you discount a little bit. You can develop a wine club so that you have a few credit cards on file. And every quarter, you release 3 wines, you build a credit cards, and you're like, okay, this is a little bit of guaranteed stuff. I give you a discount for the wine. Hopefully you appreciate it and still like the wine. Yeah, and that's a good model. As far as the wine industry, people are backing out of wine clubs right now. Everybody's worried about the future. People are drinking less because they drank too much during COVID. They drank too much at the end of COVID. Health is becoming an interesting question, not just with the older generation, but in fact, people want to be healthier now and cutting out wines. And the odd thing that's happened in the last few months, I've talked to several of these distributors, every single one of them, can you get me dry white wines? Can you get me white wines? It's like 2 years ago, you told me not to bother making red wine or white wines because you can't sell them. There's been a big shift that's occurred. And I think it's part of it is the perception that white wines are healthier, that they're lower alcohol. Some people believe they have less sulfur and less calories. And just to be clear, alcohol is the same amount of calories no matter where you're at. It's true that alcohol can be a little bit lower, but there's a lot of misinformation and really weird information that just floats around the internet as far as wine and health. We may, at some point, inevitably, we are going to put ingredients on wine labels. I'm surprised we haven't done it now. That's mainly because of the amount of pushback from large producers who don't want to have to list things like ethyl carbonate. And, there are 76 allowed wine additives. Half of them are completely benign and are derived from grapes anyway. Like you can add tannin additives, you can add oak chips, things like that. And something like oak chips, you can make a really strong argument that in fact it's more sustainable than a barrel, which is hugely wasteful. Much as we like the barrels. But it's complicated. It takes public education. But I actually, as a small producer, I want labeling on the back to happen eventually. The thing is that I'm sure by the time it's passed, there are going to be all sorts of exceptions. It's like why, when you buy a wine barrel, buy a new wine barrel, guess what? In California, you don't pay sales tax. Why? Because Mondavi got thousands of lawyers and spent millions of dollars to get wine barrels exempted from California sales tax. All right. You can do stuff like that if you have enough firepower. Gallo changed the Russian River AVA, which is, kind of a limited thing, goes up to Healdsburg. It's already too large, and there are lots of microclimates within the Russian River AVA that it's a little bit confusing. But then Gallo bought a huge vineyard outside of Katati. They were said the first round to extend the Russian River Valley all the way to Katati failed. So they hired more lawyers and threw more money at it and eventually completely remapped the entire Russian River AVA. So, yeah, there's interesting, basically, yeah, pretty much anybody can get an AVA passed if they spend enough money on it. So how meaningful is that when you see that on an appellation? You're going to pay $10 more for Russian River Valley wine than Sonoma County wine. And in theory, there's a good reason for that. It's more desirable, should be a little bit harder to grow wine. You're assured something of quality with that is the theory, but whether or not that actually translates out is a whole other question. Not to get too sidetracked, but fundamentally, if you have your choice, do you just produce wine for wholesale, make it, try to sell it by the pallet at half price, or do you try to sell it directly to consumers at higher margin? We used to think that tasting rooms are the way to go. Tasting rooms are dying right now. So people like me are like, what do we do? So we start looking at wholesale more. And this is all a pendulum. This is all going to swing back. COVID and just really, when we reopened after COVID, I had to hire 2 people just so that I could wash glasses all day. The amount of pent up demand by people who were finally let out was just, seats were full. From the moment I opened the doors to close for 3 months. It was wild. I thought it was heaven. I hated it because that's not the part of the business that I enjoy. I'm a back of house person, not a front of house hospitality. I want you to enjoy the wine, but I don't necessarily need you to love me as a person to do it. So there's a little difference there. But the person who runs your tasting room, I want them to be hungry for that. I want my server to really want approval and think that their life depends on them loving you. So different things there. And stylistically, you have to make some choices with the wine. Are you going to make wine that everybody can enjoy? Sort of the, Safeway-ish, a little bit of residual sugar, a little bit of oak, rich and creamy. That works with a lot of the population. And that's a good entry point for a lot of us into wine. I did not, when I was getting into wine, I did not like Sangiovese. It is now my favorite grape. There you go. And I am, Chianti Classico until death for me. I love those wines. I did not like them when I was learning about wine. It's like, oh, it's hollow, it's astringent, it's kind of briary, like what? And then, of course, 4 years later, all I'm doing is planting Sangiovese all over the vineyard. So these things are not etched in stone either. We're moving back from these really heavy Napa style, big, bold, like black, I work in tech kind of thing, to lighter, a little bit lower alcohol, a little fresher style of wines. And eventually that pendulum will swing or go in a different direction as well. So it's not forever. As a small business, though, you would need to decide, where are you going to situate your wines? Are you going to be middle of the road? Are you going to be niche? Are you going to be focus on sparkling? Are you going to focus on white wines? And those things will require different equipment. I actually don't have equipment that's good for making white wines. There are special presses. They're very gentle but powerful. For the fresh, fruity style of white wines, you want to have those. My press hooks up to a garden hose. It's wood slats. And yeah, no, it's very rustic.
Rustic. Is
So yeah, well, that's the polite way of. Yeah, I have dreams that have not been actuated yet. But that dovetails with this style of wine that I'm making. I'm able to get away with that because this is a refined but rustic interpretation of these Italian grapes, which is historically, that's okay with that. That might not be okay if I say that I'm Bordeaux style, which is much more polished, more oak, it's just a different model. So those things have to be consistent to have a business. You can't, if you taste these wines and then you get something, you go, oh yeah, I remember that label. Let me buy a bottle off the shelf. And it's radically different than what you remember the brand being like. That's not good. So you have to have a little bit of that passion and engagement. Being small, though, allows you to do what you want a little bit more. I mean, even though the reason that I chose Prima Materia was that it wasn't specifically Italian. So, I finally made Cab, and was lucky. It was tied for highest scoring Cabernet from Lake County. It was the first time. Lake County is a good place for Cabernet. I'm not going to take the credit for that. But I don't want to just be completely pigeonholed into Italian cultivars only. I experienced that once. And it's not necessarily a good thing, but if people like Italian wines, I want them to be able to associate the label with that. So much as I want to be narrow, I don't want to be so narrow that I shoot myself in the foot when the distributor says, do you have any Pinot or Cabernet Sauvignon for me? And you have small producers too, where it's the producer, maybe they're somebody who's famous. Maybe they were an artist. Maybe they were, have some other way of coming to the wine industry and building a brand around that. Maybe you played football. Maybe
Joe Montana.
Not just Joe Montana. I sold some wine to Andretti recently. Maybe you paint the labels. Maybe there are all sorts of ways you can approach it so that you have something that makes the brand your own. And that's half the battle, really. I mean, Napa Valley, you have 1,000 people making the same Cabernet, and somehow there's enough room for all of those pieces. Well, they're different relationships, and different groups are, different groups want to take part in that. Of course, it's easy to do if you already have some money in your pocket, but if you can access just a little piece of land, you can sort of bypass the cost of grapes, which if you're talking Napa Valley, 8,000 a ton, 10,000 a ton, up to 12,000 a ton, with 60 cases of wine coming from a ton. That's a lot. You can go to Lodi and buy pretty good grapes for 1,000 a ton. They're going to say Lodi on the label. So you may not impress your friends that way. But one nice thing that's happened in the marketplace with younger generations coming in, people want unusual grapes. They want to try something that they have never heard of before. Lodi has a lot of really interesting historical grapes planted out there. So in a way, that shift has actually been good for that area because there are more buyers. There are some vineyards of Mission out there, which was one of the first grapes planted in California 200 years ago. You couldn't sell that stuff 20 years ago. And now there's a line out the door to take part in it. So pendulum swings, good for some people, not good for others. But generally, I think it's a great thing that people are trying grapes they've never heard of before. I planted, in addition to these, Refosco, Sagrantino, some pretty obscure stuff. And that's nowhere near as obscure as the new stuff you can finally get. Sicilian grapes. You can finally plant Frappato and Nerello Mascalese and Cappuccio and things like that. You couldn't even get those 5 years ago. So again, we may be in danger of evaporating under our own weight of diversity, but for me, it's an exciting idea. And sometimes, I've made Nero d'Avola from 2 different vineyards, and I decided it would not have personality for our soil type in our area. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but sometimes you need to not chase what's novel and instead try to make good decisions based around quality. That's something as a small producer I could do. If I was just listening to people at the tasting room saying, hey, why don't you have, why don't you have this or that, then I probably would have planted a lot more. So California economics, owning a vineyard is tricky. It's so expensive here. Lake County, you can buy, I'm going to say planted vineyard land with a well, maybe for $10,000 an acre. So there are tons and tons of Napa winemakers planting grapes in Lake County right now. It's the cheapest of the 4 counties. You can still find these areas where you can grow good quality grapes, but are you on a hillside greater than 3 degrees? Then you have erosion control stuff. Can you get labor to your cool vineyard site, and will they want to walk up and down a 30-degree slope? We're definitely looking at more and more mechanical harvesting in the future because labor is just, we can have a whole other discussion about the socioeconomic factors involved in that. But more mechanical stuff is coming in the future, but you can't do that on a 30-degree hillside. If I think of my dream vineyard for what me as a winemaker, like I want the steepest, windiest, rockiest, and then I think I can't even get my car up there. How would I, within the realms of a profitable business, actually justify this stuff? So there's some practicality involved. If you're planting grapes, you're going to wait 4 years till you get a decent crop.
4 years?
Yeah. And it might be 6 or 7 years until the canopies actually fill in. You have the real. So it's a little capital tied up. That's what the bank always want to hear. Your pre-revenue for 9 years because it's going to sit in barrel for 2 years and then needs to sit in bottle for a year after it's, We're talking about long-term stuff here. So for some people, the model, if they're able to scale up, is to buy wine on the bulk market, plant vineyards, and then you transition into your own production, where you can really control the parameters, control the quality, and do the best thing you can do. But I used to, before 2018, I knew, okay, this vintage was a little bit lighter, this vintage was a little bit heavier. But it's California, some are wetter, some are hot. After the 2018 Lake County fires and watching fire burn around the lake for 2.5 months and dealing with smoke-tainted grapes, vintages take on a new meaning. And then, of course, most of us were here during COVID in 2020 where fires are burning and we're locked in our houses and the sky is orange. And it's like, what in the world is happening? So vintage fluctuation isn't just a question of grapes now. It's environmental factors. It's, will your well run dry? This last year, there was massive frost in Lodi. Lodi doesn't have frost control because for the most part, they don't get frost. They do now. And that's part of vintage variation. So some of these things that we thought were very steady and reliable, agriculture, California, and Lasami, are becoming a little more questionable. And as far as expenses for farming, a good operating, depends on where you are. 3,000 an acre is not uncommon if you want to do it right. 6,000 an acre is the new number.
How much do you get out of an acre?
3 tons. So if you think about that, the average grape price in Lake County is probably a little over 2,000 a ton. So if you planted an acre, had somebody manage it the way you want for $6,000, you got 3 tons of grapes off of it, you would have achieved zero. Yeah. Honestly, I don't know how vineyards make money. Well, I know how. It's because somebody's grandfather bought the property, tax paid. It's a legacy thing. Sure. You have to have enough, I wouldn't want to start a vineyard less than 50 acres. You have to have scalability. You have to have efficiencies. You have to have certain things in there. The only way I get away with this is by doing the work. Like I touch every vine multiple times over the growing season. So and I can't do much more than 10 acres and still have a job and run a winery and work in the tasting room and all that. So,
should probably start.
I'm sorry.
Probably start moving towards the end.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we're roughly at the end. Positives and negatives of being a small business. Equipment is really cool when you buy it. But if you don't buy it, you are buying more longevity for your brand. So the guy at the store will tell you, you should oversize everything so that you never have a problem. I say, buy used equipment, tighten the belt. You'll be fine. Just do the work as long as you have a strong back. Brand image and labels. Labels are actually fun to work at. Like, what do you want? What does your vision look like? Like, for me, that came into realizing, alchemy is kind of a cool theme to work with. And then, these public use images, these are free. Okay, I'll take those. So got 22 different wines in total. They all have a public use alcohol. Well, no, actually, there are a couple of exceptions, one of which I paid for, and one was a friend's painting. But for the most part, these are, just illustrations from old books. I wanted something simple, at least as far as layout, but something that was detailed, because hopefully that reflects, or at least that's what I'm hoping the wine reflects, is that sort of, deep but narrow, balance kind of thing. Buying barrels is lots of fun. I don't use new oak barrels, which are over $1,000 if you want French. I think I saw 800 for Hungarian. There's been a big market for domestic oak, which is cool. I think that's actually a really great field to have grow and exploit. And you're seeing barrels now like this is Missouri oak, this is Minnesota oak, there are people in Oregon using Oregon oak on their Pinot Noir. Really cool stuff. We don't use new oak for premium materia. It's just the grapes. Don't want that oaky flavor, especially when you're making 22 different bottlings. If you start putting everything in oak, it sort of collapses the flavor profile into it. There may be one or two wines that have a little bit of oak to them, but they're a little bit special. Blending is when you get to be an artist. Lay out 100 glasses with different proprietary blends. Some areas blend, some don't. It's a very Bordeaux-ish thing where you have the 6 Bordeaux grapes and your Merlot and your Cab Franc, and you're triangulating all those things. Italy is kind of a grab bag. Often you'll have, I think right now there's something like 820 different grapes identified in Italy. And there's no doubt that there's another 500 vineyards just waiting to be discovered. I mean, Italy is ground zero for grape geeks. Some areas allow you like a main percentage of this, then a percentage of that, but it's not really the Bordeaux model. But you can do it in California. You can blend, you just have to figure out what to put on the label to keep it legal, but you can be an artist. Bottling. If you're small, we hand bottle. I touched every bottle. Figure out a way to hook up nitrogen, get all the oxygen out, get a cork in there quickly. Let's see, in 2020, I hand bottled 48,000 bottles that summer. So I hate bottling. Anything else? And the record keeping. You saw, I went over all those things that you need in the beginning. It's a pain. But it's not life-ending. I sequester myself for a couple days at the end of December just to get all the cellar records straight, keep everything legal, keep it right. One of the biggest headaches, though, is if you want to legally ship to other states. Every state has their own alcohol laws. If I wanted to ship to, Pennsylvania is actually a bad example. A lot of them, I would need to have a bond, pay excise tax, pay sales tax, report every month, every millimeter, every ounce that goes into the state, even if it's 0. So you would have to make that decision. Do you want to ship to a bunch of states? Or that makes wholesale look pretty good, just having somebody else deal with it. A friend of mine, this is their graphic for the, I'm sure my friend Angela would be happy about this, the cycle of life for a red wine. The thing being, you're looking at, kind of a 3-year cycle to get everything sold. Happily, you pop the cork, you drink it, you go, oh, this is great. So this is not short-term stuff by any stretch. And then this is just a fun little graphic. For those that like winemaking, this is, I think this is a Greek winery. They actually have a blog and talk a lot about technical stuff. flow chart of choices you can make during a fermentation. So we can think of this as very hands-off, artsy kind of thing, or you can think of it as a very technical, iterative process. And it's both. It's both. The grapes this last year, record heat, 116 degrees for a week, then 2.5 inches of rain. They did not act like any vintage recently in my memory. The phenolics, the acids, the tannin development, I had to handle those grapes very differently. And I don't have any chemistry to tell me that I should. It's just I'm tasting them, I'm feeling them. They need something different. So, yeah, it can be very artistic. You can have a lab run all the numbers and tell you what to do. If you work at a big winery, it can be a recipe. Hit this number, add this part sulfur, bottle it. They used to say age it on 18 wheels. Get it out, get it sold. And then just a wrap-up breakdown. Being small, when COVID hit, I stood in the line at Safeway with 200 other people and sold thousands of dollars through the tasting room doing an e-blast on my phone. I couldn't have done that if I was a big winery. So sometimes being able to pivot and change things quickly can be an advantage. Now, of course, I got crushed 6 months later. So you can cut out middlemen. So at least you have some of that pie so you can survive while you're living out your dreams. And like that stylistic choice, is it something you passionately really believe in drinking, or is it a commodity? But, you know, you're not going to be able to buy all the things that you want to buy immediately. And you're going to be a rag doll in the winds of the general economy. So, but I think there is still a middle path so you can take all those things into account to do it correctly. So, oh, and then like supply chain, last year I paid 3 times more for bottles than the year before. You can't do anything about that. Just suck it up. So it doesn't kind of go to actually think through, like, is the business enjoyable? You still get to make wine. I still get to be out in the sun.
There's a lot of problem solving.
Yeah. There's a lot of problem solving that's just part of the game, and that can be engaging for some of us too. I would definitely not have the same model if I were to start today that I had 5 years ago when I started, but we didn't have COVID. We didn't have the economics that we have. So, yeah.
Did you said you were a chef. Did you go to any of the schools?
I did go to what was Western Culinary Institute, which was since sued and closed as a kind of a scam thing. Mainly because I had applied for over 40 jobs in Portland and nobody would hire me. And I think I was over 30 years old and I'm like, hey, I really want to cook. Like, I feel like I could just be like, no, why would I? And when I went to culinary school, I was able to, then people would hire me. So if I had the money and the time, it's better to just cook. The one thing that a culinary school can do is allow you to make lots of mistakes and get them out of your system and try new things. Is it worth $40,000 to make a lot of mistakes? Probably better to make a lot of mistakes on somebody else's time.
Did you go to any schools for being a vintner?
No.
You started planting grapes.
You read a lot. There are a couple people I don't. So when I was a chef, I worked with a lot of different chefs. I would emulate food, but I never worked for a good chef. They were either the best food I ever made was the worst human being I've ever worked for. That guy had the most amazing palate. He worked in New York City. That was in Portland. Yeah. No, it's closed and he's not there anymore. So we were runner-up for Restaurant of the Year. And when we would have been 2003, 2004, maybe. Yeah.
But this guy, if he had gone into wine, he would be just, I've never been around a palate like that was so sensitive and so articulate and could taste every nuance in the food and talk about texture. But he was a horrible human being. And I quit. And I quit in the middle of making the best food I had ever made, which was, it's the kind of like heartrending stuff to be like, I am so committed to this and I hate this place so much that this is how it ends up. But later on, I was able to work in other restaurants and remake those dishes in my own way and kind of own them and use the technique. And, you know, yeah, no, I think it is, especially since he's kind of good or was good at bringing to light some of those human elements of like, and I miss kitchens. I mean, there's a lot of, we hate each other, but we love each other in kitchens. Kitchens are different now. Like, and I think that's good because there's a lot of illegal shit that goes on and that would not, like HR department, if they knew the amount of punching, kicking, yelling, and throwing that happened in an old school kitchen. They were, I've had partners who are like,
at your wine tasting, any of the food that you as a chef?
So when I opened the tasting room, I was rolling pasta on Friday night. I was making terrines. I wanted to bring this sort of classical food thing to where the tasting room was. And after 2 months of that and days where I make and pop, you know, oxtail pappardelle, and then nobody comes in, I stopped doing it. I also didn't budget my time because I was younger and I thought I could work 80 hours a week. That's just, I could still do it. Now I can't. So, and I'm not as passionate about food as I was once. That's something I am trying to get back in touch with. But when I burned out in kitchens, I really I hit the wall pretty hard. So I'm still trying to find that thing that I really love so much to begin with food.
And how many bottles do you fit?
We're at about 1,500 to 2,000 cases, which would be 24,000 bottles.
And it's all by distributors and wine tasters.
Historically, it's been mostly through the tasting room with a little bit of distribution. I'm probably going to close the tasting room. Business has been sliding terribly. And just as I move forward in life, I am happiest in vineyards and wineries. And that's where I need to focus. Otherwise, I'm going to end up like a kitchen, you burn out. So I'm really looking for consulting work. I would love to start a second vineyard if I could find a partner. I want to use the things I've learned to help another brand grow. I'm being a one-person operation through the last 5 years has been really challenging.
Have you thought of just growing the grapes and selling them to a larger?
Yeah, and that's a good way to get to zero. It's sellable. It's workable, but just it's such a small scale and it's planted in 13 different things.
Yeah.
Which again, if I had it to do over again, I would give it up. So, but yeah, I'd like to help people build a brand now. I think I'd be good at that. And
I want to ask you something. Yeah. Any questions from the Zoom people? You have to, if you want to ask a question, you have to unzoom, mute yourself. Oh no, Barry's. Go ahead, Barry.
I wonder, where do you plan on going in the next few years? What do you
Wait.
One more time.
One more time.
What do you plan on doing in the next few years? What is your sense of direction about where you need to go, want to go, should go?
do it like this. For the last year, I've been saying as a winery, I need to either shrink or grow. I would either want to shrink down to a few hundred cases of things that I really love, keep my wine club, do that on the side, but be involved in a larger project. That probably speaks to me the most passionately. Another option would be finding a partner just to help me with the marketing side. I still want to start a second vineyard somewhere or lease a vineyard, graft it over to Italian grapes, maybe a little bit of Cabernet, just so we have something a little more mainstream as a foot in the door. That's a good way to make sure your distributor, like you can get them things that they could sell easily. But I love the Italian stuff. So I want to continue working with that. It just might be in a different place or with a different brand. But I'm totally committed to the Italian.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. But that's a good question. I'm trying to figure that out right now. There are a lot of people closing up shop right now. There are a lot of winemakers floating around looking for jobs. So it's a peculiar moment. Supposedly Gallo and some of the larger producers are shrinking operations in anticipation of this retraction in the business. So there are a lot of people floating around. So we'll see. There's opportunity in that, but it's hard to find it sometimes.
I dare say.
This is a wonderful plaque that we're going to give to Pietro for his wonderful. Here you go. That's for you. We want that on each one of your labels. No, I'm sorry.
All right.
Thank you very much. It was a very good. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for your time.
I now am going to make sure I drink a lot of wine, and I'm not going to be putting
For the good of the economy.
for the good of, that's right, for the good of the economy. So everybody, make sure you drink your wines and enjoy your wines. But thank you very much, Pietro. You did a wonderful job.
And if
Thank you
you're
very
ever
much indeed, sir.
the tasting room is in Oakland. If you're ever in the area on a Saturday, feel free to stop by. There's a big website, lots of information. Feel free to send me an email if you have a question or ever want to meet.
Okay,
Happy to do
Thank
it.
you very much.
that's it. Bye now.
Thank you.
Arrivederci.
Appreciate it. Arrivederci.